Hi everyone, welcome back to another lesson of Earth Science. Today we are going to continue with Unit 10, Climate. We are going to start jumping into understanding climate change and global warming. So we're going to split this up into three different lessons. So today's lesson is going to be on the natural variations of climate change. First thing that we need to do is actually understand what climate change actually is. And it is different from global warming. So climate change is the long-term shift of global or regional climate patterns in terms of temperature and moisture. And when we're talking about regional, we're talking about local areas. So global or very localized areas in terms of their patterns or their climate patterns. And this is naturally caused by a few things. The first thing is called the Milankovitch cycle. It's also caused by solar cycles, volcanic eruptions, and the greenhouse effect. And I'm going to save the greenhouse effect for tomorrow's lesson because that also relates to how humans play a role in climate change. First off, one of the main factors that naturally influence climate are the Milankovitch cycles. And the Milankovitch cycles basically describe changes in Earth's position relative to the sun over thousands of years. And there are three different types of the Milankovitch cycles. These are responsible for causing the beginnings and the ends of the ice ages. The first one, and the one that lasts for the longest amount of time or takes the longest amount of time to occur, is known as eccentricity. And you can see that at the bottom over here. Eccentricity has to do with Earth's orbit actually changing shape. So it varies between being more circular versus more elliptical. So if it's more elliptical, there are times where Earth is further from the sun. And if it's more circular, it's going to be, on average, more closer to the sun. And this change in Earth's orbit takes place over the course of 100,000 years for it to fully occur. The second one is known as obliquity, which is the angle of Earth's axis tilt, and it changes throughout time. It takes about 41,000 years to actually change. So Earth's tilt right now is 23.5 degrees, but we've learned that it can change between 22.5 degrees to more angled at 24.5 degrees, which will affect the temperatures, especially during the summer and winter seasons. And then the last Milankovitch cycle is precession. So this is the direction that Earth's axis is pointing towards, and this changes over approximately 23,000 years. So right now, Earth's axis is always pointing towards Polaris. It's always pointing towards the North Star. But in a few thousand years, that's going to slowly change direction. It's going to point towards a new North Star, which is Vega. So that's going to change our seasons. Our summers will be our winters will be our summers, and so on and so forth. So that describes the Milankovitch cycle. And the main thing I want you to take away from the Milankovitch cycles is it takes tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years to occur. Then you have solar cycles. And the main thing with solar cycles is sunspots release massive amounts of energy in cycles in terms of approximately 11 years they occur. And a sunspot they're darker areas, cooler areas of the sun, and they're found on the sun's surface. And these are generally over regions of intense magnetic activity. And when that magnetic activity gets really intense, it releases a ton of energy, and it creates solar flares and coronal mass ejections. So there is a direct relationship between sunspots and temperature. And you can see this picture of the sun. All these darker spots are sunspots. And if we were to zoom in, you can compare the size of the sunspot to the actual size of the Earth. You can see that a bunch of sunspots are much bigger than the size of Earth in total. So these sunspots release a ton of energy. And if you look at this graph, this red line represents the number of sunspots, and it's very cyclic. This pattern occurs on approximately an 11-year cycle. And you can see this blue line represents temperature. You can see the temperature go up and down and up and down and up and down. So there is a relationship between the total number of sunspots and temperature. But if you look at this graph, the average of this temperature graph, it's still increasing even though the number of sunspots on average stays the same. So that's just something to keep in mind. The third factor that we're going to discuss, the third natural factor, are volcanic eruptions. And volcanoes, when they erupt, release a lot of dust and ash and gases. And we've talked about this in a prior unit. We've talked about how large volcanic eruptions can release a huge amount of ash into the atmosphere. And when those ash clouds get up into the stratosphere, they're going to have global impacts. Aerosols, or particles that are released from the volcano, can stay in the atmosphere for 3 to 4 years after these large eruptions. And particles in the atmosphere are actually able to cool the climate by blocking incoming solar radiation. So these are 5 major volcanic eruptions that have occurred over the last 150 or so years. And you can see directly after each one, there's a drop in air temperature that lasts for a few years. So volcanic eruptions will have an immediate impact. Large volcanic eruptions will immediately impact the climate by actually cooling the climate, since the sunlight is actually partially blocked by these aerosols. But greenhouse gases emitted by volcanoes can warm the earth if there's a lot of eruptions. But this takes millions of years to actually occur. So if we're talking about temperatures warming on Earth, volcanoes can warm Earth's atmosphere, but again, it's a process that takes millions and millions and millions of years, and it has to do with the amount of volcanoes that are erupting. But how do we actually know how climate is changing? We can analyze what's going on right now. We have computers to view right now, but how do we know what happened 100,000 years ago? How do we know what happened 1,000,000 years ago? Well, scientists are actually able to analyze a few different things, and we're going to talk about 3 of the main things that they focus on. The first one, and probably one of the ones that makes more sense, is analyzing ice cores. So ice, especially in Antarctica and Greenland, have been there for hundreds of thousands of years. And you can dig up the ice, you create these cores, you dig down, you dig up these cores, and you can get a bunch of things. One of the main things that you'll find is inside this ice, there are air bubbles that are trapped. So you have these air bubbles of this ice that formed 100,000 or 200,000 years ago. So you can actually go into those air bubbles and actually analyze what the atmosphere truly was in terms of percentages 100,000 or 200,000 years ago, depending on what time you get it from. But also particles such as dust and ash and pollen, and even trace amounts of sea salt are trapped inside the ice. So you're able to understand the composition of the atmosphere through that, as well as the actual air temperature being imprinted within water molecules. The only thing to know about ice cores that makes it a little because it doesn't go back way too far. The oldest ice core that we have analyzed can get back up to 800,000 years ago. So it's a really long time ago in comparison to human time. What about millions of years ago? How do we analyze that? Well, there are a few other things that do that. But if we're staying in the relationship of thousands of years ago, we also can analyze tree rings. And tree rings are a very simple thing to analyze. Because it can give us data from hundreds to thousands of years ago. Trees that grow in warmer and wetter environments tend to grow more than trees that grow in colder environments. So your rings will be thicker when you're in warmer and wetter environments than when you are in cooler and drier environments. So we can determine what's going on in trees as well. There's more than just looking at the sizes of the rings. But to go back millions of years, we're going to have to analyze sediments that we find on the bottom of the ocean. So all the time, we have dead organisms that are falling to the bottom of the ocean, and they're just piling up along with dust and some sediment from both underwater landslides, rivers and streams. And these all deposit on the ocean floor, and they accumulate over millions and millions and millions of years. So we get millions of years of data by just digging up these cores of sediment. And we can analyze not just the sediment, but whatever fossils are trapped inside the sediment as well. And if you look at a fossil, if you're looking at shells inside the fossil, you can compare the different types of oxygen that are within the shell. If you have light oxygen and you have heavy oxygen, you can compare their ratios to each other to figure out the actual temperature of what was going on at Earth millions of years ago. So we have a very good understanding of what the climate was like 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, or even millions to a few 100 million years ago as well. And you can see here that we have this graph that relates to carbon dioxide versus temperature. So the carbon dioxide is the blue line and the temperature is the red line. This is just over the past 400,000 years. But you can see that there is a cyclic occurrence of both carbon dioxide and temperature. They are directly related to each other. So the higher your carbon dioxide, the higher your temperature. So that is why we mainly focus on carbon dioxide when we're talking about greenhouse gases. But one thing that I want you to realize is we only focused on the natural influences of climate in this lesson. So this graph over here on the right allows us to flow into our next lesson. If you look at this green shaded section here, that would be the natural factors only. So the Milankovitch cycles, volcanic eruptions, solar flares, solar irradiance. And we would see that the global temperature would be relatively constant. There are some, fluctuations that are occurring as well, but it's mainly constant. But if we added human factors, we would see this blue trend over here of it increasing in terms of the global temperature. And our actual observations are following this trend of the blue section here that are both natural and human factors. And I pulled this up from NASA website, and you can see the amount of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere over the past 800,000 years, with year zero being approximately today. And you can see this is in terms of parts per million of carbon dioxide. So the way to think of that is if you looked up into the atmosphere and you saw a million dots, a certain number of those dots would be carbon dioxide. So, at about 1950-ish, there were just over 300 parts per million. So if you're looking at dots in the atmosphere, if there were a million dots, only 300 of them would be carbon. But today, our parts per million are over 400 parts per million, which doesn't seem like a lot. But because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, which again, we will talk about tomorrow, it does have a significant impact. And you can see the natural fluctuations that occur in climate. And yes, climate does change. So there are natural variations to climate that we are currently discussing, but there are other impacts on climate as well, and that we will talk about tomorrow. So that is not all you need to know about the natural variations of climate, but that is most of what you need to know about the natural variations of climate. Have a good day.